In this series, I will tell about the books from the collection of the Cultural Center Our Texas, which are all books representing the history of Russian diaspora. They show the kind of questions that Russian people abroad were interested in throughout the 20th century, how they tried to maintain their cultural identity and make sense of events happening around them. As a scholar of religion, I will be focusing on books about religion and spirituality, trying to demonstrate how these topics reflected wider attempts of Russian people in diaspora to make sense of the world around them. And I will start with this volume. It's a book published in 1937 in Harbin, China. In fact, it is the second edition. The first one was published in 1920s in Shanghai. And I should say that China, after the 1917 revolution, became one of the major centers of Russian diaspora. There were plenty of publications happening at the time in China, and this is just one example of that. The author of this book, Lev Grasset, was a son of a Russian diplomat stationed in China before the 1917 revolution. He grew up in China, in Harbin, and studied in Europe at Sorbonne and at the University of Berlin before returning to China, where between the mid-1920s and the mid-1930s he became a prolific author, publishing around 20 books of poetry and non-fiction. This one is one of his non-fiction books. It's called The Apocalypse of Gender, and it's a book of theology and philosophy. Here Grasset constructs a fairly original interpretation of Christianity rooted in modern science and Russian philosophy of the first decades of the 20th century, and at the same time constructed in a critical dialogue with esoteric and occult ideas popular in Russian diaspora around the same time. So, The Apocalypse of Gender is the title of this book, and the gender is the key category that Grasset uses. He understands gender in pretty much the same way as, for example, it exists in Chinese philosophy, where yin and yang are understood as cosmological female and male principles that can be applied to anything in the universe. So the way Grasset uses the idea of gender here is the same. For example, he likes to use language of modern science, and he uses an atom as an example illustrating his idea, saying that atom is only possible as a result of existence of negative and positive particles, electrons and protons. But then he points out, aside from electrons and protons, there are also neutral particles, neutrons. And he thinks that in our understanding of gender, we also need the third element, which is neither male nor female. And he thinks that the revelation of Christianity is precisely the existence of this third gender. In fact, he thinks that Jesus Christ himself is the manifestation of this third gender, because for him the Trinity consists of the Father, the Holy Ghost, who is also understood by Grasset as mother or feminine principle, and then Jesus, who is neither male nor female in this narrative. Well, this interpretation of Christianity has some roots or some precedents in the history of Christian theology. For example, angels in Christianity are understood as genderless, neither male nor female, and the same idea applied to monks and nuns throughout history of Christianity. But asceticism is not what Grasset is talking about, because he does not deny marriage, he does not deny sexuality, although he says that the goal of anything related to interactions between men and women should not be just sexuality itself. Rather, he advocates for this idea of humanity that should become more balanced and in a way genderless. He sees marriage, for example, as a process in which a man and a woman, through interaction with each other, sort of make each other more androgynous. So man takes some like female quote unquote characteristics from his wife, and the wife takes some male characteristics from her husband. So for him, again, the message of Christianity is the message of the need of transcending the gender to become this more complete, more holistic, and ultimately androgynous beings. So this is more or less how he understands the gender and how he constructs his ideal of the society of the future. The reason why the book is called The Apocalypse of the Gender is because he thinks that the book of Revelation in the Bible tells us about what will happen, or what would happen, if we do not reach this androgynous state. The alternative to that is precisely what Grasset understands as the content of the book of Revelation, where everything is about sexuality and polarization of forces. So he thinks that unless we are able to sort of combine male and female principle into something that transcends them, we are doomed to live in a society of larger and larger polarization, which manifests on the one hand in the growing omnipresence of sexuality in culture, which is what he sees around himself in the beginning of the 20th century, but also leading to other things like conflicts between people and nation. And he thinks that this is precisely what manifests in phenomena like the Russian Revolution, for example, and he thinks of the Soviet society as one of these manifestations of this apocalyptic story. Now, as I've already said, Grasset is also interested in the omnipresent interest to esoteric and occult ideas existing in Russian immigration at this time. And a big chunk of this book is about topics like yoga and Freemasonry and theosophy, all of the things extremely popular in Russian diaspora at the time, and particularly in Shanghai. So he provides, in a way, a Christian interpretation of these esoteric practices, saying that esoteric practices represent pre-Christian and therefore incomplete wisdom. For him, Christianity supersedes these esoteric practices and, in fact, delivers what they had promised, but that they could never properly reach. That being said, he himself eagerly uses esoteric language to clarify his own understanding of Christianity. He uses terms like the astral plane, and he even recommends a certain practice towards the end of this book, which is a kind of meditation that should be performed every day for several days. And as Grasset describes, it seems to me that he himself had actually practiced something like that. So after several days of meditation, Grasset says that a person would be able to perceive directly and immediately the spiritual real. So in a way, this book is a beautiful, beautiful testimony of the melting pot of ideas that the Russian immigration was. We can see here ideas rooted in Russian religious philosophy and theology, in the interest to alternative spirituality and occult movements, as well as the reflection on political and historical events happening around Grasset at the time.